Hey guys, this is Infinite Flash here today. Today I'm going to be talking about what happened in Game 4 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. In this game we have Carlsen playing white and Anand playing black. In Game 3 we saw Anand winning very surprisingly, but just absolutely crushing Carlsen in his opening preparation. Carlsen entered a very difficult to play line in the Queen's Gambit declined and quickly got a very uncomfortable position. Anand just dominated him. Let's see what happened today. In this game we have a Sicilian defense, and usually Carlsen always goes for d4 or maybe even a close Sicilian, but in this game he chose a interesting anti-Sicilian that leads to an interesting structure really. After g3, knight c6, bishop g2, followed by d5. It looks like black has the center, and that is the case. But I think white has a pretty decent idea behind all of this to allow black to have the center like that. After castles, knight f6. White has the idea to take part in the center with his own pawns, not with the c pawn. That would allow black to push d4 and take a lot of space, and that would be a Benoni. Instead, white would actually now play d4 like the Carlsen did. And if you look at the structure, if you move the pawn over to this square, this would be a Queen's Gambit Tarrasch variation. So just think of it like a Queen's Gambit Tarrasch, but instead of the e pawn, you have the c pawn here, and you have the e file open, but you also don't have such easy pressure along the c file like you would in the Tarrasch. So it's an interesting position type that you get here. Bishop e7 played by Anand. He's just focused on developing his pieces to very active squares and getting quick development. That's black's idea. White's idea is to try to perhaps take on c5 and play against the isolated pawn at some point. Maybe. But in this game, Carlsen chose to overprotect his pawn here on d4. He's not really afraid of knight g4, by the way. I think white would go bishop f4 here, and it's not really clear what your knight is doing here on g4, so you can't really afford to do that, I think. In this game, Anand just chose to take with the pawn, and after the natural knight takes d4, bishop g4, attacking the queen right over here. White is finding it annoying to move in this position, actually. If you play knight f3, I think this is just an annoying pin on this knight, and black has ideas as soon enough to play the d4 pawn push, relying on this pin right over here. Maybe not immediately, but soon enough. This doesn't look natural at all because it's just a pin anyway, so black has opportunities to play knight e5 at some point, and some other move that is slowing down white's development. Moves like bishop f3 trade off the light squared bishops, which you don't want, I think. Bishop f3 just looks unnatural too, and f3 weakens a lot of squares, so queen d3 played by Carlsen makes a lot of sense. Certainly he could have played also queen d2, but I mean this just controls the e4 square, so I mean it just can't be bad. Queen d7, supporting this bishop, attacking the h3 square, and I mean getting his rooks connected after the black king decides to castle. Knight d2 played by Carlsen. He's planning to reroute this knight to either the b3 or the f3 square, eventually push c3 and get almost like a French Tarrasch looking like position. Very interesting setup really. Castles. And now we have sorry guys, I just had someone come in just for a second. Had to pause it. As I was saying, just castling, getting that rook connected, and now in this position, Magnus played knight to f3 to support his strong point here on d4, and his control over the center is very apparent. But black really doesn't care about that. He just develops his own pieces too. And after rook fe1, the position is probably balanced actually. Instead of rook fe1, you might be wondering, if I could play knight to e5 at some point, I could win the bishop pair, but unfortunately the knight is here to stop that. But then your thought process might think, why not just take the knight first? And the idea behind that is that after the pawn captures on c6, white could win the bishop pair with knight e5, but I think black is getting good play with queen e6, takes, and now this bishop has to move, and the bishop would probably have to drop back to the d2 square when black is getting pretty good play. with bishop f6, in my opinion. You can play knight e5. You can play probably bishop c5 too. And, well, there are plenty of tactics going on in this position. Obviously black is doing okay. I mean, a natural move like rook e1 probably just runs into knight takes f2, and you're getting a colossal amount of trades here getting done, and I think black should be doing quite okay in this kind of endgame that's going to be approaching, where he has two pawns and a rook for the two bishops, but I mean, he should be doing okay in this kind of position. He doesn't necessarily even have to play this kind of line. I'm sure that instead of bishop c5, you can play knight e5 or just bishop f6 and be quite fine and satisfied with that. In this game, instead of knight takes c6, we saw Carlsen play rook fe1. Yeah, I mean, the position's just pretty level at this point. Bishop d6. Anand really wants to improve the position of his bishop. He could also go bishop f8, but that's not as active. And with bishop d6, he is just improving the position of his bishop, really. Also getting the bishop off the file where the rook wants to activate itself. So that makes a lot of sense. c3 by Carlsen, supporting that d4 strong point, just solidifying everything. And now h6 by Anand. I think his idea is to pretty much prevent bishop g5 in the captures on f6, where white would have a little bit more firm control and potential attacks on the d5 pawn right over here. I mean, Carlsen surely could have gone rook d81 first, but he chose queen f1. A pretty unusual move. I mean, knight b5 doesn't really do anything, I think. In fact, I think it just doesn't do well in general because of bishop f3, and if you capture this knight, I think you are running into this, takes, and now knight e5, when you're actually in serious trouble. Even if you take here with check, I think this kind of continuation with knight f3 is extremely dangerous, so you've got to be careful. But of course, I mean, you don't need to do that at all. You can just play it safe like Carlsen did with queen f1, and I mean, there's not much happening really. Bishop h5 by Anand to perhaps reroute this bishop back to the square, and Carlsen didn't see really anything better than to play h3 and control this g4 square from the knight that could possibly come here. Bishop g6 was played by Anand, and rook 81, finally centralizing the last piece into the game. Anand did the same, and now Carlsen decided to relieve the tension in the center. I mean, I don't really see many moves in this kind of position for white. I like black's position actually, because his pieces look firmer in the center. They feel better in my opinion, and the queen on f1 just looks offside really. I mean, if the queen was on an active square, I don't know, not d2 where the knight might come here, but let's say on an active square like b3 or perhaps h4, I would feel much better about white's position, but this queen feels offside. So, I mean, it's kind of understandable what Magnus is doing here with knight takes c6. So, and his idea is that after the pawn captures, notice that black doesn't want to take with the queen because you're always left with this isolated pawn, and after knight d4, you're left searching for answers. Why did you not take with the pawn? So, you want to make sure that you have this connected pawns right here. And Carlsen's idea was that now you can play this pawn to c4 push. And here his idea is just to capture the pawn here at some point and have no pawn weaknesses and just have decent pieces on every square except the queen, that is. One thing that Anand certainly could have done here is try to move something to the b file and gain a little bit of pressure on the pawn to probably queen b7 in fact, to help support this pawn, and try to find a plan from here I think is a good idea. And probably white would play bishop d4 to support the pawn right over here. Bishop d4 also threatens the knight here on this square on f6, so he's threatening to double the pawns here and wreck black's pawn structure. Black would probably continue with knight e4. This is what could have happened, and probably the captures, and rook e3, pointing rook b3 is giving white a pretty decent position. I don't think black really has many problems though. His d5 pawn is not a weakness so much, and he has really nice bishops in this kind of position, and a strong knight supported by potentially active rook. I don't think black should be complaining at all about this position. Instead of queen b7, which is certainly fine. I mean, he just went bishop e4, but I mean, the game pretty much dies out from here since Magnus is not seeing anything better, and I can't see anything better than the game continuation, really, with bishop d4, getting this bishop active like we want to. But the thing is, Anand is not allowing this this capture. He could allow it though, with like a move like rook b8, but I'm not so confident about this kind of structure. It doesn't look so bad, but I mean, why allow it? Instead, he played knight h7, dropping the knight back and just leaving this bishop to open to questions here. And white now decided to capture the pawn over here. And well, now certainly Anand could have captured with the pawn back, but I mean, and really have not so many problems in this kind of position. I think black's doing quite fine in this kind of position, but he decided to capture with the bishop, and now Magnus took one rook off and decided not to play rook e1 and got the other one rook off. He has a weakness over here that he needs to address, so he decided to play queen d3. I guess if bishop a2, then you would have bishop g7 when queen d6 is on already, so you've got to be a little bit careful if you're black there. Knight f8 to support the position is very, very solid for black, so that's a pretty nice move for Anand. And now Carlsen now played knight h4. Planning to go to f5, you can see that the queen and knight are really working nicely here. I feel like white's position's very appealing, actually. I don't know, I mean, I like this bishop right here, I like the bishop right here, the knight on jumping to f5 with queen, and all this stuff going along the d file is making me prefer white, but really black doesn't have any problems, in my opinion. Here Anand actually decided to trade off this monster bishop with bishop e5. He could also play knight e6, but it's not so clear. It's not that bad for black, but I'm just saying it's annoying to play sometimes, I think, to play this position, since after bishop c3 this bishop is really not being opposed along this diagonal, and that can get annoying if you're black, so he just decided to oppose it first and foremost and get rid of it. But you know, now it's a major concern, not a major concern, but now the game is pretty much dying out. Carlsen could have played the captures here on e5, and I think after rook takes e5, f4, gaining a tempo on this rook e8, and now just the natural knight f5 move. White is potentially going to snap off this bishop here and leave black with an isolated pawn here no matter what he does. I think this is giving black some slight problems, but I mean, a move like queen c7 is pretty much just killing all those hopes. I think that white would probably just take, and queen d5 is met by queen b6 probably, followed by queen b2. I don't think, and rook e2 is also a threat you need to watch out for, so you need to be careful about black's counterplay. Maybe white shouldn't take immediately, and maybe you should play some kind of prophylactic move against queen b6 and rook e2. I'm not sure what it is, but certainly I don't think black is doing badly at all. So that was one possibility. Instead of takes, we saw captures on d5 here. Yeah, and here I think Anand captured with the queen. That's a fine move. Bishop takes, queen takes, d3. But the problem is, even though black is a slightly weaker pawn structure, this is not so significant, and he gets to pretty good pieces with rook d8, as you can see. And after knight f3, queen f6, always attacking this knight over here, and I don't think black really has any problems with such nice pieces coming into the center soon along these squares potentially, and rook d8 is already a move, so Carlsen decided to protect his knight so he can move his queen. Just, you know, trying to make sure it's not loose, even though it's not really hanging. But after rook d8, I mean, a pair of rooks are pretty much coming off the board. Anand played rook d5 to allow himself to take back with the c pawn, since the rook captures here is what is happening. There's not really much else that white can do. There's not much going on in general, I think. You got to be a little bit careful if you're white here. Random activity like that is potentially getting you into trouble, I think, because of or maybe just because of the rook hanging. Just realized I'm very very silly right now. So um, yeah, there's not really that much white can do other than to take and play this semi endgame where it's really equal. No, black has the strong pass deep pawn, and really white has good activity, so it really should be a draw in the end. Here's one slight interesting moment where Anand could have really gotten into an interesting endgame, I think, with the pass deep pawn and white's slightly weak pawn structure, but um, I don't think this is that much of a problem after a4. White has good chances and should get the king active very fast, I think, via this either route, and really is quite fine in this kind of position. So keeping the queens on the board makes a lot more sense. He played queen d7 after the g4 pawn push, and now I think Carlsen's playing a good move in queen e5 to gain a tempo against this knight and activating this queen where it controls. Basically, it's just, I want to say this is the octopus queen controlling literally everything, every kind of square at once. That's an ideal square for the queen right there. 96 played by Anand, retreating the knight, but I guess black doesn't really have any problems at all in my opinion. King g3, queen b5, knight e4. Trading up a pair of knights since this pawn is going to drop if you're not careful. Knight c7 is pretty much hanging, so there's not really another way other than just to take, and king takes, check, king f3, d4, queen e8 is pretty much approaching a draw, but there's some small tricks that black has to pay attention to. H7, queen takes, and I guess this is one of the key moments that Anand needed to be careful of. If he allows queen c3 check without really thinking that much, I think that he is actually running into trouble because of king e4, and it's not really clear how to proceed. I think white is going to drop back his queen to this square, queen d2, queen f3, queen takes, king takes. I think is probably just equal, but I mean you're down a pawn and it's a symmetrical. I mean black should be able to draw, but it's not very comfortable since you're down a clear pawn on the king side. So I mean, why allow that? That's just not. That's just the d pawn is your trump card here. Why would you give it away? And the key is not to allow this king to activate itself so easily. The idea is that instead of queen c3, Anand played a really good move in queen d2, and the idea is that after king e4, I think black is pushing the pawn here to potentially allow the pawn push to here when you give this queen check here. White will probably drop back, and after queen e2, a very very clever check, queen e3. Queen takes now is pretty much going to be drawing the game for black. If king takes, then you would take here on the b3 square, and if the queen takes here, then queen takes f2 is giving black very very good play with equal material. So that's a very very clever way to go about things. I think that was very nice. That was a very nice find that Anand found, and I don't know. I mean, one possible continuation is just this one where there's nothing really happening. Instead of king e4, I think Carlsen decided to play queen f5, and now I think that after king h8 played by Anand, h4, the game is pretty much dying out into a draw by perpetual check. White really can't play for a win since this d pawn is really really strong. There's always like slight annoying checks over here to allow the pass pawn to be pushed, and it can be very difficult to stop this if you're not careful for white. It's difficult to arrange any of your threats. If there was a pawn on here, these kind of squares, then maybe if somehow the pawn was allowed to go to g6, then white would have very interesting chances to attack black, but it's just not happening, and there's no way black is really going to lose this, I think. And white doesn't really have anything better than the draw. So they actually agreed to a draw in this position on move 47 after king h7. A pretty well played game and balanced game throughout. Each side had small chances to gain a little bit of something, but it's really nothing special. So it's a perfectly understandable draw. Nothing spectacular, all very very quiet and just a basically a quiet game, but nothing too boring, I think, for the audience. So that's good to see that none of the games have been too boring, and there's a lot of interesting kind of structural changes in these kind of positions where both sides somehow get small chances to improve the position. But the problem is with these kind of positions is that you have a tendency to trade so many pieces if you have two open center files like that, and it just nothing materialized. So overall, I think a pretty well played game by both sides, and I'll be covering the game 5 that'll be happening, and I don't think it's tomorrow. I think it's going to be the next game, but I'm very glad to go over these games for you guys. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you guys watching this stuff for me. I'll be seeing you next time. Peace out.